Thank you, Felix. So now I'd just like to start with a short introduction for Charles. Charles is an attorney advisor for the U.S. Army and a lifelong politician. He won a special state election to become only the second Republican since statehood to represent Hawaii in the U.S. House of Representatives. Djou worked to control spending and lower taxes, and he was not afraid to break ties with his party on issues that he felt strongly about. Djou, who was previously in the Hawaii House of Representatives and the Honolulu City Council, was the first Thai American of any party and the first Chinese American Republican to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. Let's all give a warm virtual welcome to Charles.
Thank you.
So Charles, if you'd like to start just with, maybe opening general thoughts.
Sure. Let me just start. Thank you very, very much. Good morning to everybody in China, and good afternoon from my haunt here in the Hawaiian Islands. It's a delight to chat with everybody. For me, this is a particular honor. My father was born in Shanghai, and he grew up in Hong Kong. My mother was born and raised in Bangkok, Thailand. So for me to be able to talk back to my father's home country in Beijing, this is a particular honor and a special delight for myself. Eric has already given a little bit about my background, having served in elected government here in the United States, and the municipal, state, as well as federal level of United States government. I'm also a U.S. Army veteran. I served in the U.S. Army Reserve and served in Afghanistan with the U.S. military. And it's really, it's a true delight for me to share with all of you my experiences in government and politics and what it's like to have been an elected official as an Asian American in American government. Now, Eric, do you want me to get into a little bit about what got me into politics, or do you want me to touch a little bit more on my background? How would you like me to go?
Let's start a little with the background. I'm also curious too. Just you mentioned your family history. Where did you grow up in the United States? Aside from Hawaii, have you lived in any other regions of the country?
Sure. So, again, as I had mentioned, my father was born in China, in Shanghai. My mother was born in Bangkok, Thailand. I grew up here in Hawaii. My wife is also here from Hawaii. We're raising our children here. My parents continue to live here in the state of Hawaii in the Pacific. Myself, however, in terms of my background, after I graduated from high school in Hawaii, I attended college at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I went to law school at the University of Southern California, which is in Los Angeles, California. Also, much later in life, I went and got a master's degree in strategic studies from the United States Army War College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So in terms of my career, yes, I have served in the Honolulu City Council, the Hawaii State Legislature, and in the United States Congress. I worked for a number of years in private practice, as well as an attorney, civilian attorney for the United States Army. I actually recently started a new position, so this is relatively new for the embassy. About 6 weeks ago, I started a position. I am the Secretary and Chief Executive of an independent federal agency called the American Battle Monuments Commission. This is an agency which runs and manages all of America's battlefields outside the United States. The most famous of which is the Normandy landings in France, but also the battlefields at Bellewood, Belgium, Philippines, Mexico. And it's an incredible honor to be continuing to serve my country and be part of the legacy of the United States. So, yes, married, 3 wonderful children. I have a son, 2 daughters, and we have a dog also.
Great. Thank you, Charles. And, so before I get into questions, I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions that come up as we're having our conversation, please feel free to submit them in the chat room. So, Charles, the aim of this series is to talk about Asian American experiences in American politics. So my first question to you is, what inspired you to participate in politics and to ultimately run for public office?
Yeah, sure. Politics and running for public office is certainly not something that was natural for my family. My mother, having grown up in Thailand, which was and still is a monarchy, my father, having been born in Shanghai and raised in Hong Kong, elective office is not something that was natural to either one of my parents. My route to this, I think, is twofold. First, my mother immigrated to the United States via Michigan. She actually was an interpreter for the United States Air Force when America was engaged in the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia. She came to the United States to study at Central Michigan University. That was her first exposure to the United States and to the political systems in the U.S. My mother's sponsor, who was my godmother actually, and was a professor at Central Michigan University, assisted my mother in becoming an American citizen. And this woman, my godmother's brother, was a state senator in the state of Michigan, which got my mom interested in elective politics. This was something very different for my family, that average citizens being able to have not just a voice, but being allowed to craft the laws of the land of their community was something unique and different. It's something that my mom very much embraced and imposed and shared with myself and my brother growing up here in the United States, that this is something important, special, and unique about America, and that distinguishes America from my mom's home country of Thailand, as well as my father's home country of China. For myself specifically, when I was growing up as a child, going to high school here in Hawaii, during my junior year of high school, my high school social studies teacher forced all of us high school students to go out and spend the day campaigning for any candidate running for public office at the time. I just happened to have chosen a woman named Patricia Psyche. She was running for the United States Congress. I was a teenager at the time. I didn't know any better. But I got to know Congresswoman Psyche. She, I thought, was a very good candidate. She represented the values that I believed in. I think she was sincere. She was honest. She was trying to do the right thing for our community. She herself was a Japanese American. And I got involved in her campaign. I stayed involved with her campaigns. She later on in 1990 ran for the United States Senate. And in 1994, she ran for the governorship of the state of Hawaii. I volunteered and helped her in all of those campaigns. And then through her, got involved in politics myself. And for me, one of the real special things for me was 25 years after I was this pimple-faced high school kid that really didn't know what the heck I was doing, volunteering, stuffing envelopes, and doing the lowest level menial jobs for this candidate running for the United States Congress. 25 years later, I got elected to the United States Congress from that very same seat that Congresswoman Psyche had first gotten elected to when she first ran for office. And so that was sort of my introduction, my induction into elective politics here in the United States.
That's a great story. That I didn't know. I feel like that would be one of the best ways to educate teenagers about our political system by, giving them that opportunity. So,
Eric, actually, if I can interrupt just very briefly, so amongst the amazing things, for me, and the things that I found extraordinarily humbling, being an elected official, being involved in American politics, when I took the oath of office to become a United States Congressman, when I first entered Washington, D.C. as a representative from Hawaii to represent Hawaii in America's national government, my mother was extraordinarily proud, and my swearing in was broadcast on C-SPAN, which, for those in China who are not familiar, C-SPAN is a public access network. It broadcasts the activities that's going on in China, in the United States Congress around the world on the internet as well as on television. My relatives in Bangkok watched my swearing in live. For them, I think it was some ungodly hour of the evening to watch me get sworn in Washington, D.C. A military coup was going on at the same time in Bangkok. The day I was sworn in, the Thai military had come in to Bangkok with its guns and its tanks rolling through the middle of the streets of Bangkok. There was tear gas and soldiers with guns. Unfortunately, several people did lose their lives. But for me, it was an extraordinarily poignant punctuation of the American system of government versus that of my mother's home country and my father's home country, for that matter. I don't believe the United States is perfect. I think the United States has made numerous mistakes. Our nation has a number of flaws. But I think for all of America's flaws, for all of America's mistakes, our democratic system, which our nation cherishes, is one of our nation's strengths. It isn't always perfect. It doesn't always work right. But for myself in my life, getting sworn in as a congressman in the United States at the exact same time when my cousins in Thailand were living through a military coup, I think in a lot of ways encapsulated for myself and encapsulated for my family the beauty of American democracy, and that the people get to decide, and that the government rules only with the consent of the government. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean it's always smooth. It doesn't mean that there aren't bips and bumps and errors that are made. But it does mean that everybody at least can get a say, and that certainly someone such as myself, a child of immigrants, a child of a father from China and a mother from Thailand, can rise up to the highest levels of American government. And that, I think, is one of the beauties of the United States.
No, thank you. Thank you for adding that. I think that's just part of, one of the quintessential American stories, the stories of immigrants and our experiences, the ups and downs. So, you mentioned how your mother had the early exposure into state politics in Michigan. And, you said that you were volunteering and working with parties during elections. What was their reaction when you made the decision to shift from, being a supporter to being the face on the campaign signs?
Yeah, I think for my family, being immigrants, it was, to say the least, eyebrow raising for my family. Let me also add here, so on my father's side of the family, my father's side from China, my father, my grandfather, all of my uncles, all of my male first cousins, as well as my brother, are all engineers. Like a lot of Chinese families, when one person joins a particular profession, everybody, or at least all the boys in the profession, are expected to do the same thing. So that my father, grandfather, brother were all civil engineers. I was already a little bit of an oddball in my family in deciding that I went to go to law school instead of go to engineering school, as all the other men in my family had done. I think for my family, it was a raising of an eyebrow that, well, are you sure, son, you really want to do this? Are you sure that this is the right course of action for you? You already went to law school instead of going to engineering school. What are you doing with politics? But, I think for my family, after getting over the initial hurdles of me deciding to run for public office, I think my family embraced it. I think they were able to see that you don't have to just sit there and be a passive observer of your government. That when you run for and serve in public office, you actually can make a difference. You don't just have to sit there and accept the status quo. And so let me give you some very small, for examples. I mean, something that seems very, very small. One of the first things I did when I got elected to public office, there was a particular intersection in my community. There was a number of car accidents at this particular intersection. I mean, that's, in the grand scheme of things, not a big deal. But when I got elected, I pushed through and got a four-way stop put in, and got it put in, relatively speaking, quickly as a state representative. I know that sounds small, but it is an example of how a problem had lingered in the community. Every member of the community knew that this one particular intersection was trouble. But by running for office and getting elected to office, I could actually do something about it, and was able to put in a four-way stop and reduce the number of accidents there. Now, of course, I know there are much, much bigger issues that are talked about. I mean, certainly when I was in Congress, we talked about America's war in Afghanistan, what we do with American healthcare, the structure of America's tax system. But it's also in those small little things that you don't just have to sit and accept the way the government bureaucracy does things, that just because it has always been that way, even if it's nonsensical and doesn't make common sense, by running and serving an elective office, you can make a difference that I think perhaps the bureaucracy and the government institutions don't always see. And so for me, that was a good reaction, I think, from my parents, that, oh my gosh, you actually can make a difference and get in a stop sign where all these accidents were occurring. So that has been a delight. On a different note, I will say, in American politics, a lot of running for office is shaking hands, meeting people, getting out there, getting yourself known. My parents, being immigrants, being that English was not their first language, this was something very unusual for them, to get out there and shake hands and meet people. I think they were always much more comfortable letting me take the lead on all of this. Thankfully, I have an exceptionally patient wife who supported me and helped me through all of these. So that also has been a delight. And campaigning and running for office has been frustrating, and has been tiring, but it also, in an odd sort of way, been a bonding experience for my family. Today, even my children, my daughters, they are used to dad going off and being in politics and talking about issues of the day and what's going on in elected office. And that has been a delight also.
Yeah, that's great to hear. One question we mentioned in the introduction, and you mentioned yourself, your experiences in the Army. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that experience was like, and how that also impacted, your public service career.
Sure. So I have been and still am in the United States Army Reserve. What that means is I'm a part-time soldier. Usually, Army reservists, we serve about 1 weekend a month, plus an additional 2 weeks of active duty per year. We supplement America's active duty force. This actually has been a real honor and delight for me. I think the United States Army has a lot of very good values of discipline, of focus, of making sure you accomplish a mission. I also want to share, as an Asian American in the United States Army, very frequently I was the only Asian American in a particular unit. I recall when I went through basic training, my 40-member platoon, I was the only Asian American in my unit. Most units I have been in, I have been in either the only Asian American or one of only a tiny handful of Asian Americans in a particular unit. But I think it speaks to the best of America that I never felt different, distinguished, or separated. If anything, the Army, the United States Army, I think has done a very good job to make sure that the only color people see is Army green. And if there's distinguishing, it's distinguished based on your rank, whether you're a sergeant or a lieutenant or you're a colonel. That's the only distinguishing that goes on. And the United States Army, I think, has done a very good job. Not perfect, but I think, not just the Army, the United States military has done a good job in promoting individuals based on merit, based on your leadership skills and abilities. And you can see it, minorities have reached the highest ranks of the United States military. I think for Asian Americans, and for myself in particular, Eric Shinseki, who is originally from my home state of Hawaii, is a Japanese American and became the chief of staff of the United States Army. And I think that is a good thing. I think that is a strength of the American military, that it is based upon your skill and your ability as a military leader and not based on your background, where you're from, whether it's Hawaii or whether you're Asian American or African American or Hispanic American. And so again, yes, for me on the whole, not perfect. There have been bumps on the road, but on the whole has been a very good experience for me serving in the Army Reserve. And I'm very proud to have served. And yes, my service did include one tour of duty in Afghanistan in 2011, 2012.
No, thank you for sharing that, Charles. So one question, it could be maybe they jumped in a little later, but it's a good opportunity to ask, because I think many people had some questions. They were asking about your hometown or Chinese hometown connections. If I understood that correctly, your father was originally from Shanghai. Your mother is originally from Thailand. But could you tell us a little more about your last name? Because it doesn't look like Pinyin.
Yes, no, it is not Pinyin. So a little bit about my father's background, at least. So I have to confess, I don't speak Shanghainese. Shanghainese is the native language of my father and my grandfather. And even more specifically, my father, after the Communist Revolution, fled with my grandfather to Hong Kong. So my father's second language is actually Cantonese, not Mandarin. And I understand my last name is more normally translated Chow in Cantonese. But my last name in terms of background, although I understand that it is occasionally translated as Djou, my grandfather, and my father's side of the family, I understand, according to family lore, actually their hometown is in the old French quarter of Shanghai. Shanghai, I'm sure all Chinese listeners are very familiar with. Shanghai was quartered by the Western powers in the early 20th century. There was, I think, a British, American, and French quarters of Shanghai. My family's home way back then was in the French Quarter, and my grandfather worked for a Frenchman, and he worked for a French company, and the French name Djou sounds somewhat similar, I understand, to the Shanghainese translation of Djou. As I understand it, in the French language, Djou means to be playful in the French language. Gives you a little bit of insight into my grandfather's personality. But in Mandarin, my Chinese last name is more commonly translated as Djou. I understand it is similar to Zhou Enlai, the former prime minister of China. So that's my Chinese heritage and my Chinese background. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting. So just in case to clarify, that would be Zhou, as in Zhou Enlai, the Zhou.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how how immigration and different languages start to take the original form, and it kind of goes on its own journey. Very, very common.
Yes, and if I could just add here, so my grandfather, when he immigrated after the Communist Revolution from Shanghai to Hong Kong, the fact that he had this very odd spelling of his last name meant nothing to him because he didn't speak English. And everyone he knew spoke Cantonese or spoke Shanghainese in his Shanghainese community. So a consequence that on his British immigration papers, his last name was spelled Djou, which is not normal in English, meant very, very little to him. It was only it is only when my father immigrated to the United States to go to college at Rice University in Houston, Texas, that my father began to realize that this was not normal. And of course, me growing up here in the United States, yes, I've had to explain to people over and over again here, this is actually a French translation, not an English translation of my Chinese surname.
Yeah, that's great. So, for the viewers, please keep the questions coming in. Another question I wanted to ask you. Last week we had Christine Chen from APIA Votes kind of give our viewers a general education about where Asian Americans are located in the U.S. and very broadly the concept of, the political inclinations of the groups. And I gave the example, it's difficult to consider any group as a monolith politically. I'm Latino, but that means very different things politically in the U.S. if you're in California or Texas or Florida. So can you give a little more background about your experiences in Hawaii? Because it's considered a little more democratic leaning.
Yes. Actually, and let me share in terms of Hawaii. Hawaii as a percentage, although not numerically, I think has the highest percentage of Asian Americans of any of the 50 states of the United States. There's a lot more percentage-wise Asian Americans here in the U.S. Excuse me, here in Hawaii compared to the rest of the U.S. What I think perhaps is a little interesting or a little bit different is the plurality, not the majority, but the plurality of Asian Americans in my home state of Hawaii are actually Japanese Americans, not Chinese Americans, as is the case in most of the mainland United States. In terms of politics and political leanings, yes, Hawaii as a state has historically been and continues to be more Democrat leaning and has voted for Democrats for president in the United States Congress much more frequently than it has voted for Republicans. And part of that actually comes from the large Japanese American population in Hawaii. In the Second World War, the United States still had a segregated military. There was a very famous Japanese American military unit that fought for the United States and against the Axis powers. They fought in Europe against Germany, bringing them a lot of acclaim. Most of them were from the state of Hawaii. And they organized under the Democratic Party banner, having an enormous amount of influence in my home state of Hawaii. And as a consequence, I think they had an extended influence in the local politics here in Hawaii. But I want to add here, so for those of you who are viewing from China, I am very sensitive, and I do understand the historical sensitivities between China and Japan, and especially the very tragic, brutal, and difficult period of the Second World War and the engagement between Japan and China. I want to share that that's just not really the case in the United States, and particularly not the case here in Hawaii. For myself personally, my wife is Japanese American, whereas I, of course, my family heritage is from China. I just mentioning politics but also ethnic differences and whatnot. I think my family, again, if they raise eyebrows with me entering politics, maybe perhaps also raised even more eyebrows that my then girlfriend and now wife was Japanese American. But here in Hawaii, in the United States, I think that's perfectly normal. And I don't think there's that sort of distinction or differences. And it's something that I'm very happy about. The fact that I am Asian American, but I have a multi-ethnic Asian background of my father, my mother, and my wife. And of course, by extension, my children. And I think that's one of the beauties of the United States.
Charles. So could I ask, from your political career, what have been some of the highlights or, I guess it kind of depends how you interpret it. Highlights or the biggest challenges that you faced during your public service career?
I let me answer that on several different levels. I think for me, each time I served in elected government, whether it was the city, at the state, or the federal level of government, there are certain things that I remember from each. For me, there are certainly, of course, I do remember obviously the biggest issues are the things that stand out, whether or not the United States should remain in war in Afghanistan, which was a major vote that I had when I was a congressman. Should we reform America's healthcare system? Under then President Obama had proposed something called Obamacare to expand healthcare access in the United States. But I think the most profound things that I have enjoyed in politics actually comes from helping individual people and making a difference in my own community. And let me give you some examples of that here. So when I was in the Honolulu City Council, one of the things that I'm very proud that I had worked on was to establish a recycling program here in my home community of Honolulu. Again, I know that doesn't sound huge. I know that doesn't sound remarkably profound, but it makes a difference to individuals and individual families. And for us here in Hawaii, when you live on an island and you don't have a lot of landfill space, reducing the amount of trash in our community, it's something that affects real people. And I think the ability to affect and improve the lives of individuals is something that I think that I have found rewarding in Congress, in elected politics. Another example, from my days when I was a U.S. congressman, I had a strong interest in what was happening and what continues to happen on the Korean Peninsula. When I was in Congress, there was an incident in which 10 South Korean fishermen had gotten captured by the North Korean government. Their fishing boat had just strayed just a little bit over the borderline demarcating North and South Korea. And I pushed and pushed and pushed, and it was a big pain to the American State Department. Sorry to all of you in Beijing Embassy, to push for the release of these particular fishermen. Again, I know this is not a huge thing. It is not something that affected global events. It's not something that changed the dynamic of how North and South Korea relate to one another. But these fishermen were eventually released, in part through the pressure applied by the American State Department. And it made the difference in the lives of these 10 particular individuals and their families. And this ability to affect people's lives for the better, I think is something that I've always found rewarding and probably the best aspects of American politics. If I can add as a side note, now I am continuing to serve in government in this new role, in this new position I have, maintaining the history and the memories of America's battlefields, which include America's cemeteries of our service members overseas. It's a good thing. It's a good cause. It's to do something not just for yourself, but to do something for a larger cause, bigger than yourself, to be able to make a difference for your community and for your country. I have again and again found that when you do something bigger than yourself, it is far more rewarding than any financial reward that you could have.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, for sharing. You mentioned in the beginning, when you were in high school, and 25 years later, you had the honor to represent your district in Hawaii. I was wondering, from your perspective, what do you think is the trend for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders in participation in politics, for the next generation and whatnot?
Very positive, very positive. Hiram Fong, he's a former United States Senator. When Hawaii became an American state, he got elected to the United States Senate, and that was in 1959. When Hiram Fong got elected and became a United States Senator, he was very unique. I mean, there were just lots and lots of questions about an Asian American entering the United States Senate, and what would it be like to have a Chinese American participating in making the laws of the land of the United States of America. And I think Senator Fong was a trailblazer in that he very gently, politely explains he's an American. and he's making laws and crafted them for the benefit of the United States and for his home state, my home state of Hawaii. And that was his interest. And his interest was representing Hawaii, not Chinese Americans, not China. I think today, in the 21st century, we have moved far and away beyond that. It is no longer considered unique or strange or different to be an Asian American entering Congress or entering the most senior levels of government. I am happy in some ways. Vice President Kamala Harris being half Indian American. You've seen Elaine Chao, the former Secretary of Transportation under the Trump administration, coming into office and almost no questions asked about their ethnic background, about being Indian American, or in Elaine Chao's case, about being Chinese American. I mean, the questions Secretary Chao, Vice President Harris were asked when they entered office, and continued to be asked during their times in office, was what their policies are. What do they want to do? How do they want to implement? And they have been criticized for their policy-making decisions, not on their ethnic background. And that's something I think that speaks well of America. It doesn't mean, again, I emphasize here, America is not perfect. It doesn't mean that there isn't some issues and some challenges to overcome as an Asian American involved in American politics. But as a broad general statement, I do think that is something that is very, very positive. Let me contrast that I think, in my father's home country, for those of you in China, for my mother's home country in Thailand, if somebody were non-Thai got into senior office in Thailand, I think there would be an awful lot of questions, and the person would constantly have to defend their decisions as to what they're doing and why they're doing it because of their identity. My hunch is the same would probably occur in China if someone were, say, Kenyan American, or even French, not Kenyan American, someone were Kenyan or French or Russian, were placed on the Politburo in China. I think there'd be a lot of questions raised. But in America, not that it's perfect, not that there's no problems or flaws, but I do think it is a positive thing that your ethnic identity as an Asian American in the highest levels of American government is no longer considered strange at all. And what people are much more interested in is what you are going to do in your position than where your background might be.
Thank you, Charles. I think that is definitely a part of American history. We're just seeing more and more that our government is becoming more and more representative or reflective of the people that it serves, right?
Yes.
So one question that I had, and this is something that we've asked all of our speakers. Recently, in the past couple of years, there's been a surge in anti-Asian violence, and it's a very unfortunate trend. My question to you would be, based on your experiences, what would you think is the best way to combat this rise in anti-Asian hate and violence?
Well, let me respond to that in several parts. First, that is this anti-Asian violence, this violence being upon Asian Americans in the United States. My perception is those outside the United States don't really perhaps have the best view of this. And what I mean by that here is I think the perception by some in the foreign media are making it into a problem that is far, far bigger than it actually is. I'm not saying it doesn't occur. I'm not denying that this is something that happens in the United States, but I don't think it is an endemic problem that is widespread and that every Asian American is always constantly on a daily basis a victim or beaten here in America. Indeed, myself personally, I'm testimony having gotten elected to the United States Congress, having served in the United States Army, have gotten promoted in both the United States Army as well as in the American government, that this sort of anti-Asian bias, while not denying that it exists in the United States, is not as big as perhaps I think a lot of foreign media make it out to be. Now, with that said here, this is something that I think America has struggled with, but I am happy to say that America has struggled with fits and starts to successfully overcome. It has taken time, and it has taken time of Asian Americans succeeding in American society, succeeding in business, succeeding in our culture, succeeding in our government. And this is a history which is not different from other immigrant communities that came into the United States. Certainly a century ago, the experience of, say, Italian Americans or Irish Americans, Americans who came from the Catholic faith, I think in the early 20th century also had a number of challenges and problems that they had to overcome. Today in 21st century America, I mean, if you're Irish American or Catholic in the United States, I mean, nobody bats an eye. It's not, nobody would consider being Catholic in the United States or consider being Italian in the United States as awkward or odd or unique at all in any sort of way. I think the experience for Asian Americans is similar. I think Asian Americans do have a challenge of overcoming this. I think the current generation of Asian Americans have a responsibility to pave the way for future generations, just as the grandparents of today's Italian Americans and Irish Americans paved the way for today's generation. I think today's generation of Asian Americans have a responsibility to embrace America, to take advantage of what America has to offer, and to show to society, to show to the world that America is a place where you can succeed, where it might not be easy. It's not paved with, brick golds of brick, but it is someplace where you can succeed. And yes, there is a very small minority that does have this lingering sort of hate, of mistrust, of the xenophobia. That is something I will admit has been part of the United States from our nation's inception. It is not something I think the United States should be proud of. But I really want to emphasize this is not something that is new to America, and it is not something that America hasn't repeatedly experienced and successfully overcome. And I am confident over the next generation, just as Catholics and Italians and Irish before Asian Americans were able to overcome this, I am confident Asian Americans will also. And it is my hope that my children's generation, this will be a non-issue.
Thank you for sharing that, Charles. So here's one of the questions that we got from the chat. It was more about, from their perspective, it seems that political views are becoming more and more polarized in the United States. They mentioned the difference between watching Fox TV and I guess they said watching the New York Times or maybe CNN.
Yeah.
From your perspective, how would you react to that kind of assessment, that from the outside it looks like there's more political polarization?
Yeah. This is, I think, the current really big challenge in the United States, this deep political polarization going on in the United States. I think this is remarkably unhealthy for American democracy. I don't like it. For myself personally, when I got elected as a Republican to the United States Congress, I was a relatively moderate Republican. Today, I was appointed to my current position by President Biden, who is a Democrat, despite the fact that I had been a Republican in the United States Congress. I think there is too little of that going on in America today, and we do need to overcome that in American politics. But what I want to pause here on is to emphasize that this too is not something unique in American history. I mean, American politics goes through multiple cycles, and there are times when American politics gets extremely polarized, and then times where American politics seem to be a little bit of a mush, and everybody sort of gloms together, and there's a complaint that the parties don't distinguish between themselves. One of my favorite quotes is actually from a British statesman, Winston Churchill, who once said that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. In American politics, we have gone through various phases in our government. Historically, actually, if you look, in the mid to late 20th century of American politics, the complaint of American politics was there was no distinction between the parties. The complaint for most of mid 20th century American politics was this general mush, that everybody looked the same, sounded the same, didn't distinguish themselves, and there was really no tough competition of ideas. Starting in the early 21st century, that the pendulum began to swing dramatically the other direction. I think today, now in the 2020s, I think it's swung too far. I'm confident, or I'm hopeful as well as confident. Maybe not in the next election cycle this year in 2022, but that over time, I think the pendulum will swing back. And I'm hopeful that American politics will moderate itself. Maybe perhaps it'll come with the rise of a third political party in the United States. I don't know. That has been tried numerous times before. Maybe it'll come with a new political leader from one of the political parties, the Democrat or the Republican Party. But before anybody writes the obituary of America and American politics and say this is a crisis which we cannot overcome, I would just say that I don't like it. I think it is bad. I think we need to reduce the amount of polarization in American politics, but emphasize that this is not the first time America has gone through this. We have gone through it successfully before, and I'm confident we will get through this again. It might not be quick, and it might not be clean, and it might not be pretty, but we will get through this.
Thanks, Charles. And, one of the questions I would think kind of as a follow-up, you were running for office at different periods, not this recent period, but did you have any experiences when you were out there shaking hands, meeting people, trying to get your name recognition out, where you came face to face with that kind of polarization, or, and how did you manage it?
Yes. So yes, unfortunately, that is something that came up a lot in American politics. For me personally, when I ran for public office as a Republican in a very staunch Democrat state of Hawaii, I had to overcome, I think, a lot of times people not even willing to listen to me. That just because of my political party's identification, people wouldn't even give me a chance. It wasn't my ethnicity that was stopping me. It was my political party and my political identification. I found the way you overcome it, quite frankly, is hard work. There's nothing that beats hard work. I always viewed it every time I ran for office that as hard as my opponent worked, I would work harder than them. Whatever they did, I would just do more. It is a challenge. But I am happy to say that it was a challenge that I was able to overcome. And you overcome it with hard work. You overcome it one person at a time. I mean, that's the ultimate way to succeed, is meeting voters one voter at a time. I am troubled, and I will say that I think that has become increasingly difficult in American politics. When I first started running for office, and I'm dating myself here, when I first ran for public office 20 years ago, I will acknowledge it was easier then 20 years ago than it is today. I think the polarization of American politics today has made that more challenging in American governments, but more challenging does not mean impossible. And I'm still cautiously optimistic. American politics and the way American politics is structured and how we do this will eventually change. The one constant you can count on in American politics has changed.
Yes, very true. Lots of cycles.
Yeah.
So Charles, I know we're coming near the end of the 1 hour program. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of offer, kind of closing thoughts. And the way I always phrase it is, what is the main message that you would want our viewers here in the People's Republic of China to take away?
Mhm. It's what I would like the people of China to know, to understand, is that America is a very vibrant country. And it is a country not identified by a particular race or a particular ethnicity. It is defined by an idea. The United States, I'm going to paraphrase the former President Ronald Reagan here. The word American, unlike the word Chinese, unlike the word French, unlike the word Russian, unlike the word Japanese, the word American does not connote an ethnic group. It does not connote a language. It barely connotes a food cuisine, unlike the word Chinese or the word Japanese, or the word Russian or the word French or the word English. Rather, the word American identifies a group of individuals who believe in a specific set of ideas. And anybody can believe in this group of ideas. President Reagan, in his closing address as President of the United States when he left the presidency, I think he eloquently put it that you can go to Japan, speak the language, but you'll never really truly become Japanese. You can go to Russia and learn Russian, but you'll never really truly become Russian. Same with French or Chinese or English. But in the United States, it doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter what your parents look like or where they were from. It doesn't matter what cuisine you like to eat. What matters is whether or not you believe in this principle of the United States. This is the best, I think, of America. And it is something that I want people in China to understand, that is open to them also. And that America is not opposed to anything Chinese. After all, I myself have a Chinese heritage. What America wants, what America believes in, what America supports is this concept, this idea that all men are created equal, that government shall rule only with consent of the government, that there is not a destiny of any ethnicity or any culture that should reign supreme, but rather it is a set of ideas. It has long been said that America is an ongoing experiment. I still think it is an ongoing experiment, but it is an ongoing experiment that I want to invite all the people of China to look at, observe, and if they would like, participate in. This is not some sort of American, and I really want to emphasize to the people of China, I realize American-Chinese relations are not the healthiest. They're not the best they have been in recent years compared to previous decades. But this is not because America has a historic animosity to China. It is not because America views China as an enemy. Much rather, I would like China and Chinese people to come and understand that America is about this set of ideas, and it is a set of ideas that I think is the best of our nation. And I also want to emphasize, I make no claim, and I don't think America makes any claim, that we are a perfect nation with a perfect culture and mistake-free. Rather, I think that the beauty of America is not in our perfection, but rather in our nation's desire to make an ever more perfect union. And it is that striving to make an ever more perfect union that is really the beauty of the United States. And if there's anything that all the listeners and viewers can take away, that's the one aspect I would hope you take away about my presentation today.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles, for talking to us today. It was great. It was an honor to meet you virtually. Of course, we want to wish you best of luck with your new career. And at this point, we are going to put up a QR code for the participants. If you could please scan and give your feedback. This is how we can improve our future sessions. We have one more session coming up That will be on Wednesday, July 27th. So thank you again to everybody for participating. Thank you for submitting your questions. And please go ahead and scan the QR code.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks so much here. All the best, everyone.